Hey guys, it's Ramon coming to you live with Bold Like a Leopard. Another quick take, maybe not as quick as I'd like, but I'd like to talk about a topic that would not be really within large public knowledge. It's not really common knowledge what I'm about to talk about because it just isn't taught in school anywhere. Some of those obscure nerd things that you get when you read about communism and socialism for years and years. And it's a topic, it's a little theme called Salami Strategy. For those of you that have read a little about communism, I know one of my viewers, Nick Taylor, is pretty well versed. The Cultural Revolution is known as one of the most famous communist abuses of history, in which the communist regime of Chairman Mao Zedong, decided that they would, as a revolution, replace all of Chinese society and culture with a new revolutionary culture, a proletarian culture that held the worker to be at the center of all of its themes and topics. It was basically saying that everything that happened in ancient China, in terms of art, in terms of music, in terms of literature, ideas, philosophy, religion, all of it had to go to the dumpster because it was depraved and decadent and would not facilitate an equal society. Now, does that sound anything like the world we have today? I've argued before that it does. And there's a very simple reason for it, because the more that people can hold on to ties to the past, even under Stalinism, they still held, classical art and culture to be very important. That's why you did have a number of, composers that were never explicitly banned, to my knowledge, under Stalin, Tchaikovsky and whatever. And I'm not a fan of classical music, by the way. I just happen to know that in the Soviet Union, they still allowed classical art and music to be featured because they viewed this as kind of a universal value, that good art doesn't really need to be screened necessarily. Now, that was only art that was grandfathered in. As for rock music, and I'm going to try to read somebody that has an interesting topic. If you want to do a little homework for down the road, look up Dean Reed. Dean Reed, okay? I'm not going to say any more about that because I want some of it to be a surprise. Otherwise, you wouldn't need to watch the video. But yeah, when America came through with new types of music like jazz and rock and roll, the Soviet Union viewed them as decadent, corrupt aspects of capitalism, so they did not allow them in. So that was one step of cultural censorship in the Soviet Union, and by extension in other parts of the Soviet Empire as they expanded. In China, however, they went a step further and they abolished many forms of ancient and native art. They would go to certain Chinese ethnic groups. Remember, China is not just one ethnicity. There's actually 4 main ethnicities of China, and then a lot of distinct minorities. I mean, Tibet, for example, is not China in terms of culture and language. It's very different. The religious worship is not really the same. I mean, there's similarities, but it's just very distinct. Cheers. If they really banned rum and coke, that would be a real crime. So what's the Salami Strategy? We've already talked about the Cultural Revolution, which is only about, basically eliminating all of your cultural opponents. And there were other aspects of Mao's rule that were very draconian and Byzantine, where he would eliminate his opponents. One of the things that he did was engage in the Salami Strategy, but that term was not coined in China. Now, You might have to bear with me. I know you're used to my regular technical difficulties on my PC, which is actually updating slow as fuck right now. And I'm just staring at this orange screen. So while I'm doing that, you guys can enjoy this mug here. There's an issue where what happens when a communist regime comes to power in a country that it didn't necessarily happen through a natural revolution, or even if it did. But let's take Hungary, for example. They were occupied after World War II. They were occupied during World War II, by the way. Hungary was a German ally during World War II. At some point, the ruler of Hungary, his name was Admiral Horthy, rebelled against. He said to the Nazis, I don't need to go down with the ship with you guys. I'm going to do whatever the hell I want. And the Germans took him out. They basically put him in prison. And it became a Nazi puppet. And then once the Soviets took it over, they stayed there. The Soviet army stayed there. The only issue was, now the Soviet army can stay there, but having a Soviet army on your soil does not necessarily make you a communist state. They can only do so much. When you're an occupying force, the people treat you like one, and it doesn't matter whether the previous government was unpopular or not. That's one of the reasons I'm against interventionism in many cases. So let me see if I can open the chat in case anybody's asking questions. You might hear a little interference in a second. Oh, good, it's off. Okay, there's nobody in the chat. So anyway, this strategy comes into play here. Once you occupy a country that despises that wants to be free, and let's talk about Hungary again, occupied by the Soviets after World War II. Then, when you're administering it, you do have to deal with the people that are local that may be in charge. And what did the Soviets do? They picked the people to be their representatives that were reliable stooges of Stalinism, or of Stalin himself. They were actual plants put there by him in order to do his bidding. And what they ended up doing was leveraging every single advantage that they had. This is from the magazine Telepolis. I think it's from Germany. And it's from September 4th, 2000. It says, and I think this was in the context of the FBI opening offices in Budapest, but they were talking about the same issue with the Salami Strategy. It says, half a century ago, in order to assume and consolidate power, the Communist Party in Hungary, led by the ultra-Stalinist Matyas Rakosi, adopted a strategy known as salami tactics. This entailed a gradual process of threats and alliances as a means of overcoming opposition. Consequently, the communists were able to exert their influence and eventually dominate the political landscape slice by slice. It's ironic that 5 decades later, the same tactics are being used, this time not by a Moscow-trained communist elite, but by a capital elite based in Washington, what the KGB succeeded in doing in Hungary and the rest of Central and Eastern Europe at the end of the Second World War. The FBI has now been doing in the post-Cold War period. Earlier this year, the FBI officially opened a branch office in Budapest. The official reason given was to assist the Hungarian authorities in their fight against the Russian mafia. This would entail not only intelligence gathering, but it will also mean the establishment of an informer network. Now, half a year later, the same has happened elsewhere, this time in Romania. Man, these updates are fucking slow as hell. The reason behind the FBI opening a Bucharest branch office is more of the same. Together with the Romanian authorities, they will concentrate their efforts on combating economic crimes, the trafficking of migrants, child pornography, and organized crime. The official line in Romania for the establishment of the office is that it will facilitate the coordination of activities and sharing of information between the FBI and the Romanian Secret Service. However, it's also no secret that by allowing American police officers to operate within the country, Romania hopes to come one step closer to becoming a part of NATO. This, unfortunately, is a tempting carrot that has been dangled in front of all governments within the region in one way or another. Promises of admittance to the EU and NATO are often used as a means to extract political and economic concessions. In the end, many Central and European countries end up with broken dreams, as with NATO and the war in Yugoslavia, and unfulfilled promises. And here they say uncertain and delayed entrance into the EU. What is worrying about all this is the extent to which the U.S. has filled the power vacuum left by the former Soviet Union. Indeed, in many respects, the influence of American power is much greater. In the case of Romania, Soviet troops had left the country in 1958. It appears only a matter of time before American forces will establish their own base, as they did in Tăjar in South Hungary. Although FBI agents working in Romania are supposedly there to help in the fight against organized crime, there is no doubt that their presence is part of the new economic order. So then it kind of goes and focuses more on the state aspect, the military being part of the government over there in Eastern Europe in terms of the American government. That's not really where I was going here. You have to consider this, okay? In the American landscape, we think that there are two political parties. There's the Republicans and the Democrats. In reality, those of you that watch the programs that we all watch, you know, and I'm talking about, for example, mine and the Anthony program. Hold on. Those of you that watch that type of program, you know that the political parties are broken. The Democrats are not satisfying progressives because they don't actually enact policies that help end income inequality, things like that. They're actually a fake party. They don't really stand for anything. They stand for, you know, all these statements that really don't go anywhere, but at the end of the day, they do that what's politically expedient in order to make a little money, and sometimes a lot of money. The Republicans are the same way, except with a different public and a different agenda and a few different pet industries. And that's not that different, by the way. So how does the Salami strategy come into play? What they do here is very similar to communist strategy in Hungary. They may not have the communist economic policy, so to speak, but they have the communist authoritarian policy, which is very simple. All they have to say is this. If there is a group, you can call them, for example, these Proud Boys, these people that go and they fight Antifa at some of these rallies, or you have journalists like Mike Cernovich, or even Tim Pool, who's an amazing journalist who is not really a committed political activist. He's more of a center-left person, but with, he has contacts with all people. He's a person who can get along with anybody. Ostensibly, there's people that, are impossible to talk to, but he will do his best to talk to anybody. Those types of people, what the powers that be do, these political parties and, they're real masters in the media and in the industries that they serve. And I'm not trying to point at a particular group, okay, because I'm trying to say that the powers that be in the American economic system, what they do is they'll point at those independent figures like Poole and Cernovich and whatever activists you're talking about, or even President Trump, and they will say, look, those people are fascists. They don't share our values. They are, they'll say things like, not in our name, not my president. Or they will go and they will call anybody they disagree with a fascist. They will they will use slogans like "smash white supremacy." And when you try to come in and have a conversation on this and say, I think that this is really becoming violent and inflammatory, what they will say is that you are tolerating hate, therefore you're part of the problem. You are one of the fascists. So what they do is it's a strategy of intimidation. Gradually, every single group that is involved that is not of their political stripe gets attacked. They will start with the real right-wingers, and those are still present in our society. They just don't have necessarily a good venue to talk about, or venue to present their views, I should say. That's very evident to me. That you can talk about Fox News being conservative. The fact of the matter is, if you tune into Fox News today and compare it to the way it was in the mid-2000s, it's not very conservative, to be honest with you, in terms of any of its views. There's plenty of people on it that have blatantly liberal or just uncommitted views towards anything. Shepard Smith, for Christ's sakes, the guy has what are his views? And there's people that are they're nominally on the right, some of these Bush Republicans, David Frum, that have already conceded basically that they don't have any moral core. Frum voted for Hillary Clinton. He could have chosen not to vote. I've chosen not to vote in some elections. What was his rationale? His rationale was that Donald Trump cannot possibly be allowed to become president. He would vote for somebody who has ideals that are contrary entirely to, basically to his own stated political beliefs. This is a person who's surrendered to the Salami Strategy, which is that the powers that be, whoever they may be, and in last year's election, it was the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton machine, all those tendrils of the same organization dedicated to the same first family. They were saying that anybody that did not help them along, help her into the presidency, was basically stabbing America in the back and leading it into a dark time for America. And then they lost. And then the Salami Strategy can still go along. In the case of Hungary, it did not. Actually, I could probably look it up. I think at one point they did lose an election. Bear with me while I do that. What I'm trying to get at is that what the Salami Strategy does is it renders electoral politics basically meaningless, completely meaningless. Let me see here. I'm not sharing any screens today. If anybody has a problem with that, they can go screw themselves. Here we go, 1947. No, that was the wrong one. So 1945, parliamentary elections were held in Hungary on November 4th, 1945. They came at a turbulent moment in the country's history. World War II had had a devastating impact. The Soviet Union was occupying it, with the Hungarian Communist Party growing in numbers. A land reform that March had radically altered the property structure, and inflation was rampant. The Independent Smallholders Party won a sweeping victory, but its gains were gradually whittled away by communist salami tactics, fulfilling the predictions of their leader, Matyas Rakosi, that the defeat would not play an important role in communist plans. So, the election by secret ballot and without census or fraud is reckoned as the first relatively democratic election ever held in Hungary, and was certainly the closest thing to an honest election held in the country until 1990. It was only one of the it was also one of only 2 remotely free elections ever held in what would become the Soviet bloc, the other being the 1946 elections in Czechoslovakia. One author states it was generally fair but not entirely free, as only democratic parties were allowed to compete, meaning most of the pre-war right-wing parties were excluded, as well as those parties that did not participate in the Hungarian National Independence Front, a wartime anti-fascist alliance. So what this basically says is that it's the exact issue that we're having today. Now you can understand that right after World War II, people were very antsy about letting Nazi collaborators participate in elections. They were afraid that these people could come back into power and get their country right back into whatever problems they'd been in before. But the communist parties were allowed to participate. This despite the fact that Hungary had been ruled by a communist despot in the early 20s, I believe, Bela Kun, who committed a lot of crazy atrocities at the time. Only the leaders of the dissolved rightist parties, SS volunteers, and those in turn are being prosecuted by the People's Courts were barred from voting. The liberal electoral law was also supported by the communists, who were not bothered by the failure of their proposal to field a single list of candidates on the part of the communist, social democrat coalition parties, which would have ensured a majority for left-wing parties. Intoxicated by their recruitment successes and misjudging the effect of the land reform on their appeal, they expected an enthralling victory. And one of their leaders, Josef Revai, predicted winning as much as 70%. To their bitter disappointment, the result was nearly the opposite. The independent smallholders party, winning the contest in all 16 districts, won 57% of the vote. The Social Democrats won slightly above and the Communists slightly below 17%. Blah, blah, blah. One of the main reasons for the success of the smallholders and the failure of the communists was the fact that Cardinal Joseph Mindszenty, head of the Hungarian Catholic hierarchy, infuriated at the loss of the overwhelming majority of his property without compensation, at the clergy's being excluded from voting upon communist initiative, condemned the Marxist evil on the pastoral level, and called on the faithful to support the smallholders who upheld traditional values. So in this election, they basically kicked the communists' asses. But what ended up happening was that Hungary remained under Soviet occupation, and instead of drifting back towards independence, Hungary's government was plagued by just this subversion. These parties the communists would gradually just needle at them and say, look, you're a bunch of fascists and Nazis and whatever. And eventually people would just kind of back away from the other parties. And here we go. It says aftermath. After the election on November 9th, the 4 major parties divided the portfolios. The arrangement in which the smallholders took the interior while the communists obtained finance was rejected by Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, who instructed Voroshilov, that's the communist, the Soviet military leader who occupied Hungary, to renegotiate interior and a deputy premier post for the communists. A debate on the form of the state also ensued. Mindszenty led a vigorous monarchist campaign, but despite some uncertainty among the smallholders, a republic was chosen. The smallholders' leader, Zoltan Tildy, was elected president on February 1st, 1946, while Ferenc Nagy became prime minister of a government in which the smallholders had half the portfolios. The communists received the interior and deputy premier posts, as well as transport and social welfare. Enlisting the support of the Social Democrats and present party ministers, they would exploit these positions with tactical skill and ruthlessness against the smallholder majority, hesitant to take a tough line against a Soviet-supported left-wing grouping, especially after the left-wing bloc was created on March 5th, emphasizing the exacerbation of class warfare and the need to proceed with social revolution. So in case you're just joining us, I'm talking about the Salami Strategy. If you want to, I'll go over it again. The Salami Strategy basically was this tactic used by Hungarian communists when they were in the minority. What they would do is they would call all of their opponents one by one, starting with the real conservatives and then going closer to the center. They would call them fascists and Nazis and pigs basically, and that's how they basically, essentially they took over the communist state against the democratic mandate. I could just type in Hungarian parliamentary election 1945 in whatever search engine you want, and it will bring up the topic. They lost that election, and yet within 2 years they seized complete control of the country, and Hungary fell into Marxist tyranny, and that was the end of it. Go to the 1947 election real quick. The communists in the next election, they basically they were able to get 22.25%, and they gained only 30 seats, but that was enough to catapult them finally to the leadership position that they needed. And after that was all she wrote. They started to say, we need a real workers' leadership, and what this meant was that they could push people out of power that they didn't like. And that's what they're doing today in the media. What they're doing is they're going to people that they disagree with and calling them alt-right and fascist, and they're doing it in a very gradual way. And that's the Salami Strategy. Just like you slice one slice after another off of it. In America, what they're doing is they're going first after bona fide right-wingers, and in some cases actual neo-Nazis and fascists. I mean, the alt-right people that were in Charlottesville over the weekend, yes, I mean, it's fair to say that they have alt-right and fascist beliefs, but when you go and call people guilty by association for, first of all, belonging to similar groups that aren't as hardcore against these groups as the left wants them to be, and then on the other hand, creating a guilt by association with people that are not speaking out as vocally against it. That's how they create this optical illusion, this cognitive illusion that there are more Nazis and fascists than there are. And unfortunately, it's taking hold in the media. They don't necessarily even need Antifa. Antifa is a violent organization that is going from city to city and just attacking people, often defenseless people. I remember seeing them get into a fight with a bunch of homeless people not Baltimore, it was Portland, sorry. And the people in Portland, these homeless street people, those guys would go after, I mean, they were being harassed by these Antifa people, or the Antifa people were drawing more police presence and more riot gear and whatever. And these street people couldn't even be homeless in peace. So they were getting into altercations with these guys and throwing rocks at each other. And that's what Antifa is. They are part of the Salami Strategy, but they're only one part of it. They're not even the most important part of it. The real important element of this is the media, that they ignore the abuses of their own side, the left, and they focus with laser-like integrity on their opponents, whoever they may be. It's even left-wingers that are against Antifa and against the so-called resistance. You could lump in Tim Black and H.A. Goodman. They're being called all sorts of names all the time now. Despite the fact that they're very, very staunchly progressive, oftentimes much more progressive than the people accusing them of it. That's it. I know this took a while, but so does everything I talk about. Salami Strategy, go look it up. And hello to Angel and Dean. I see you guys. I'll talk to you later.